Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Dr. Yael Danieli, founder and director of the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma and convener of this pivotal side event. On the first day of the third meeting of the state parties of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It will begin with the international voices of veterans and descendants of nuclear-exposed communities who, in addition to honoring the memories of survivor parents, would report of their own legacies and highlight the urgency of studying and redressing these legacies to inform global policy and reparative justice practices. I will then present a report of key international intergenerational findings garnered utilizing the Danieli inventory for multi-generational legacies of trauma, the gold measure for comparatively assessing psychosocial intergenerational impacts of trauma. This inventory has been respectfully and sensitively adjusted to exploring direct and indirect effects in offspring of victim survivors of nuclear bombing and nuclear radiation and fallout exposure in multiple related languages. We have the English version, as you'll hear later, at the iglow.world, but we have many other relevant ones. This forward-looking dialogue aims to advance TPNW's mission by integrating victim survivors and descendants' experiences, cutting-edge science, and visionary leadership to chart a path toward a nuclear-free and equitable future. I now have the great honor of giving the microphone to Ambassador John Sick.
Thank you, Doctor. As we say in our language, Yahweh, meaning greetings to all of you, and good afternoon. I'm privileged that I was given the opportunity to join Dr. Daniel here and Mr. Kiefer. And I'm thankful that they could give us the opportunity to be in this important dialogue. As you probably are aware, Marshall Islands has not signed on to the TPNW just yet. And while it has not joined the TPNW, due to what we call inadequate burden shifts, which require us to pay for billions of dollars of cleanup and rehabilitation, we nonetheless seek to add to the discussion on positive obligations, and now we all can understand intergenerational impact. Our own history and experience can offer much, particularly the relationship between historical impacts and contemporary and future challenges. Even though bombing impacts happened decades ago, there are both scientific and social challenges passed on through generations, father to son and mother to daughter. Youngest and future generations inherit both impacts and advocacy. These are our current human rights and the environmental challenges, and those challenges will remain and transform for generations to come. The history of nuclear testing in the Republic of the Marshall Islands is our present reality. It will be our future too, but we can mitigate future impacts, first and foremost, when the state that conducted the nuclear testing lives up to its responsibilities and obligations. We can also ensure that just devastation is never felt by others by holding nuclear-armed states to the highest standard and calling on them to join all international efforts to abolish nuclear weapons from the earth. We look forward to learning more from all of you this afternoon. Again, thank you all, and let's really thank God for this earth we all call home. Thank you.
Sarah's going to speak first. Sarah? Yeah. I was just instructed. Thank you, Ambassador. I was just instructed to give the third generation voice first, and only then the second generation. So our first speaker is Sara Miyako Burkinshaw, who is a granddaughter of Toshiko Ishikawa Hibakusha, 6 August 1945. Sara.
I first learned the importance of talking about the effects of nuclear warfare when I was 13 years old in 7th grade. We were sitting in my social studies class learning about World War II. While most of our unit was focused on the European side of the war, we had exactly 2 paragraphs and 1 picture regarding the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The picture included in our textbook was of the infamous mushroom cloud. I remember after class that day, all of my classmates were talking about how cool that mushroom cloud looked, and that upset me greatly. I was angry, but not at my classmates because they didn't know. How could they know? They didn't know what was under that cloud, who was under that cloud. My grandmother, her friends, her family, her classmates, they had no idea about the devastation or the consequences of that mushroom cloud. So I went home from school that day very upset, and I told my mother what we had learned about and what my classmates had said. And I asked her if she could come in and talk about my grandmother's story so they could see, so they could understand. I thought maybe if they knew a personal story about what had happened, maybe they wouldn't think that mushroom cloud was so cool. Maybe they would understand the gravity of it. And that story from 80 years ago with my 12-year-old at the time grandmother under that mushroom cloud, it doesn't end there. It keeps going today. I see it whenever I look at my mother. One of my first memories growing up was of my mother being taken away to the hospital in the middle of the night because she had gotten sick. I spent my entire childhood seeing her in pain, suffering, sick, in and out of hospitals. I remember being very young, maybe 4 years old, wondering, will my mommy come home this time? Will I still have a mommy? And it's been very difficult seeing that throughout my life because I know that the reason she's sick is probably because of the radiation my grandmother was under with the bombings. I know that the radiation is likely the cause of that, and it's hard not to think about that whenever I look at her. And she wasn't always sick. She got sick when she was in her 30s. And next year, I will be turning 30. And I can't help but wonder, will I get sick too? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's 80 years after the bombings, and we are still learning new things about how the radiation trickles down through the generations. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to my mother so she can tell the rest of her story.
Thank you, sweetie.
Thank you, sweetie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel with these esteemed guests. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, my goodness. Sorry. It's an honor to be here with these esteemed guests today and also to have been an advisory council member for ICMGLT. And when looking over the Danieli inventory for nuclear bomb survivors, I realized that I was not alone in a lot of my childhood experiences. And I also realized how much my childhood shaped my voice today as a second-gen Hibakusha. I have this one memory with my mom when I was younger and can still feel the comfort of her rubbing my back and singing to me in Japanese songs so that I could fall asleep. She also did that when I was having terrible pain days, even though I was in my 30s. And especially when she would sing the Cherry Blossom song. That was very special. Now, growing up, one other big thing that I remember is my mom waking me up at the age of 5 with a blood-curdling scream. And that was the first time I ever remember her dreaming about something I had no idea what it would be. I also wouldn't know why these dreams got worse at the beginning of every August. And I also wouldn't know that she was actually from Hiroshima until I was 11. That summer, because I remembered the year before she acted the same way, I pestered her enough to tell me, and she said, I'm actually from Hiroshima, not Tokyo. But I lost my family and my friends and my home that day. And I'm sorry, that just, And then she said, don't tell anyone. So I didn't say anything. And I would not learn why her nightmares were so horrific. And she would still not tell me. Throughout my childhood, my mother, every time she got a twinge of pain or would feel really tired, would say to me, I'm going to die. And it frightened me because I didn't understand her fear of radiation diseases yet. As Sara had alluded to, I was 31 years old when I was hospitalized with a deep vein thrombosis and I nearly died. And so was in the hospital with complications, and it was one of many stays for a month. When I came home, I needed help for me. Sara was only 4, and my husband, Matt, was working during the day, so my parents came. I was diagnosed with reflex sympathetic dystrophy, which is a chronic progressive neuropain disease that affects the sympathetic nervous system as well as your immune system. My immune system deficiencies, doctors have told me, were due to the radiation my mother was exposed to in the atomic bombing. I really changed everything that day, and I didn't know how I'd be a good mom on the bad pain days. I knew I wouldn't be able to walk again unaided, and I became very, very depressed. And it was at that time my mother started talking to me of August 6th. And when she was done telling me, she said, I'm telling you this now because I wanted to take my life. I lost everyone that day. Her life changed suddenly at the age of 12. But she said, I'm so glad that I didn't, because I have you and I have your daughter to love. And that she reminded me that I still had the same samurai blood through my veins, and I would have strength and I would find my own way. So years later, when I spoke with Sara's class, it lifted the weight of the memories that were silenced all that time to be able to talk about it. I could share how a twist of fate had her papa, instead of working from home in the morning, going into the train station, and he was in the center of town that day. My mother was sick that weekend, so she had one more day to stay home and rest. That kept her out of the center of town where her classmates were that day. And instead, she was outside talking with her best friend who was older, and she says, I remember seeing a plane, but it was a weather plane. But then shortly after, there was another engine. And she said, as the hair on the back of her neck went up, she saw this bright, intense white light, and there was this ear-shattering popping noise, and the ground just shook, so her and her friend just held on to each other screaming. By the end of that day, she would have lost and watched her beloved papa die. She would have lost the friend that she had clung to hours before, and would lose the rest of her family members that she grew up with over the next few years because of radiation sickness. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I can still hear her voice telling me this. And every time she told me, she would cry, and she would see it as if she was watching it all over again in front of her. And as a child, I remember watching and reacting to her extreme depression, to her unexpected, unexplained outbursts of anger, as well as her hellish nightmares, and I just didn't understand. And then now today, I live with it every day with her scar of having RSD, and as it painfully progresses. But I have to say, all that she lost, my mother never lost her ability to love. And I am just so grateful because she lived to be 82 years old, and she was only ill the last few months of her life. And I remember getting the contract for the book, The Last Cherry Blossom, and I presented it to her. It was November 2014. She took it, and she said, "I never understood why I'm still alive when I lost everyone. But now I finally know. I lost everyone, and I couldn't tell my story. But I had you, and you can tell my story. And so now I've been able to speak with thousands of children around the world about what her story was, about the last cherry blossom. And the one thing that really makes them take notice is that story of that 12-year-old girl in Hiroshima who my mother thought no one would care to hear about. And in fact, I recently received a letter from a 7th grader after they read The Last Cherry Blossom, and I spoke to her class. Oh, shoot. My letter's down there. I am so very sorry. Oh my gosh. I can't. Can you pick that up, please? Oh, man. I'm so sorry. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I am so.
Just take a deep breath.
And this message to Sara that you're no harm.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay. I numbered the pages. I just remembered that I did that. Okay. The letter said, I'm just reading a couple sentences. I truly respect what you shared, your mother's story with the world, and continue to inspire young children across the globe. You've motivated me greatly to find out more about the historical accidents and events of my home country, Ukraine. I will always remember how your mother coped with her father's death, just as I suffered with the past deaths this summer. This book proved that every story is so powerful. And ever since 80 years have passed and technology is changing, but that need for human connection through emotions, that is timeless. And that's why I tell my mother's story. I wrote The Last Cherry Blossom, and the reason I did that is so that people will know what the ordinary citizens were doing those last 10 months of the war, before the bomb even hit, just to have a better idea of how they might have been different, but also how similar they really were to all the Allied children. And so in that way, when the bomb is dropped, then they can understand the horror and the death and everything that they suffered under those evil mushroom clouds. And because my mother was sharing her memories with us, we can continue to tell people about it. And I hope that she sees that today, that we are here. We always had the power of the 3 Ishikawa women when my daughter was born. And so it's also, say the word for me, Hinamatsuri?
Hinamatsuri.
The Girls' Day in Japan today. And so I'm hoping she sees that we are all together again.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear Kathleen and Sara. I believe Sara agreed to chair Kathleen is the chair of the working group on nuclear issues in our in the ICMGLT. Sara agreed to chair the youth working group. So all the youth here, please, you know who can lead you. Thank you. And I remember when I got the book the first time, I think I sat down and I didn't stand up until I finished. It's and it's etched in my heart, and I promise you that you will have a similar experience. So thank you for brightening my world and our world. Next, I have.
Yep. That was quite a powerful story. Thank you for sharing it.
Next is Keith Kiefer, 1977, 1980. Why won't you tell?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your interest in learning about the lifelong intergenerational effects of nuclear radiation. My name is Keith Kiefer, and I have the honor of being the United States National, or NAAV, National Commander. I'm also a veteran survivor and participant of the 1977 to 1980 Enewetak Atoll Radiological Cleanup Project. This presentation is in memory of Lincoln Grahlfs. Okay. NAAV is an acronym that stands for the National Association of Atomic Veterans. The bulk of our atomic veterans are veterans who participated in on-site nuclear testing. But being an all-inclusive group, we include all veterans that were exposed or had the potential to be exposed to ionization radiation. NAV was established to assist veteran service organizations, disabled and needy atomic veterans, members of the U.S. Armed Forces, their dependents, and the widows and orphans of the deceased veterans who are afflicted with radiological and mental health issues. I'm a veteran survivor who participated in the Republic of Marshall Islands Enewetak Atoll Radiological Cleanup Project that occurred between 1977 to 1980. Enewetak Atoll, which is or was part of the South Pacific Proving Grounds, where 43 nuclear tests occurred. However, I'm not here to talk about my own experience. My talk today is in memory of Lincoln Grahlfs. I have just returned from the celebration of life for Lincoln. Lincoln had the goal of living to 116 years old. While he didn't meet that goal, he had an extraordinary long life, especially for an atomic veteran who on average died between 40 to 60 years old. Despite living almost 102 years old, these years did not come without a cost from his military service. Lincoln, at the age of 24, participated in Operation Crossroads, Able and Baker operations in 1946 in the Marshall Islands near Bikini Atoll. Photographs of Operation Baker are unique in nuclear detonation pictures, as you can see in this slide. The searing, blinding flash that occurred obscures the target area, which took place underwater and was barely seen. The clear image of ships in the foreground and the background gives you a sense of scale, as you can see on this slide. Next slide. Lincoln's duty was operating an ocean tug named the Undaunted, performing the hazardous and the glamorous tasks of towing, rescuing, and salvaging necessary to support the actions of the fighting ships. Next slide. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Here, Lincoln is at the helm of the Undaunted, attempting to decontaminate the USS New York, which, interesting enough, was his home state. This particular ship was in Operation Crossroads Baker, and they were using contaminated water from the lagoon area here to decontaminate the boats. This water was also used for their drinking and cooking. Lincoln had many duties supporting the test programs. Not long after this, his battle with health problems began. In the spring of 1944, after Operation Crossroads, Lincoln reported to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in California. He was suffering from a strange abscess on his face and 103-degree fever, an abnormal white blood cell count. The symptoms demanded an unorthodox treatment. The doctor shot his face with x-rays with only a shield to cover his eyes. Soon after, the abscess cleared. During his treatment, the doctor said, "That was the hair of the dog that bit you." Lincoln believed he heard a coded message from the doctor's words. He knew service members were getting sick from a massive secret U.S. government program. Lincoln went on to have thyroid issues, multiple cases of skin cancers, GI problems, prostate cancer, to name a few. But the problems weren't isolated to Lincoln. Patricia, Lincoln's daughter from his first wife, fought health issues from her teenage years until she lost the battle at the age of 47. Having endocrine disorders, rare diseases, and part of her pancreas removed in her 20s, and 2 brain tumors. Lincoln believed these were the result of his radiation exposure, and he lived his entire life with that particular guilt that he was the cause of his daughter's death. When she was dying, he told her he would never give up being an advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Patricia left Lincoln 2 sons and their father behind. Lance, Lincoln's son from his second wife, even though his mother wasn't the same as Patricia's, he too suffered health issues all his life. He also had rare endocrine disorders and Addison's disease. He lost his battle at age 60. Losing your children is something no father should ever experience. Lincoln managed before his dying to arrange for this to be delivered upon his death. This is titled "When I Die." Tradition has it that Horace Mann, on his deathbed, said to some Antioch students, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for mankind." I, meaning Lincoln, am not ashamed to die, but in sense I shall never be ready to die. A significant part of my life has been devoted to the good fight, to achieve those victories. But more than half a century of that effort has convinced me that the struggle can never be considered over. So I consider my passing as mere passing on of the torch to a new generation who must never permit it to be extinguished. How can you carry on the torch? Unlike conventional weapons, nuclear exposures consist of invisible bullets. Often there's no outward evidence of the entrance or exit wound. This experience still comes with the potential to manifest its impact, often years later, physically through DNA damage or psychologically through the trauma. We believe that using tools of the Denali inventory and DNA testing, the impact could be scientifically proven and the damage treated earlier as well as properly. I encourage individuals to promote and participate in the studies. Governments to establish the dedicated trust fund to support these studies. And also individuals contributing. Implementation, reparation programs based on these also be implemented based on these studies. Lincoln was a member of the honorary board of the International Center for Study of Prevention and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. Let's carry on the torch for Lincoln. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kathy, but she's feeling as affected by. She also knew Lincoln as we did. Kathy, please.
I am a storyteller, and I hold people's history and I share it. I've spoken with people all over the world affected by nuclear weapons, fallout, nuclear waste, transporting it, and we are the rare and hopefully last human beings directly and generationally affected by the above-ground testing and use of nuclear weapons. My father was a 17-year-old at the Pacific Proving Grounds in 1958, and he witnessed men being scrubbed with wire brushes, and he felt the fear, anger, and panic of his commanders when an open porthole was reported below deck during a test. For decades, he feared government retaliation if he spoke up. The secrecy was ingrained in him, the weight of silence, the fear of losing his benefits, the unspoken rule to never question authority. I advocated for years for others, but my dad was too afraid for me to do it for him. When I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, after many other tumors, the brain tumor was a big one. My father could not bear to even acknowledge it. Confronting it meant confronting the truth he had been forced to bury. He himself had been diagnosed with OCD, PTSD, and last April he passed away from 4 separate cancers, and we lost him in just 28 days. Our voices, our genetics, our trauma, these unite us as a global community. The private and veterans medical sectors must recognize our conditions, and funding is essential to ensure we are heard. We need acknowledgement and understanding. iGlow has taken the first steps, forging partnerships to bring light to our struggle. For 4 years, StillGlowing searched for a genetic company willing to work with us, and again, we heard the words hot potato. Institutions feared the implications of aligning with our cause. Then we met a biologist on social media, someone who also suffered from rare illnesses, and he understood the frustration of our story and what we deal with as a community, and he decided he wanted to help. Dr. Daniele reached out to our community, offering the Daniele Inventory, a validated tool, the gold standard for assessing the impacts of multi-generational trauma. It has been difficult to help people understand that the denial of our experience is in itself a trauma. We spent almost a year working with multiple nuclear-affected communities to work on quantifying our trauma. We need this alongside genetic research to build treatment protocols and better understand our global family's history and future. We are one generation removed from the silence and secrets carried by our parents. Our lived experience of illness and trauma span almost 80 years. Over the years, it has become clear our global nuclear-exposed community shares many secrets, fears, and physical anomalies. Our struggle remains the same. We have been denied access to the scientific truth about our own bodies and emotions. Our medical history has been classified. Our lived truths have been denied. Victoria, my partner in StillGlowing, who couldn't make it today because she's actively fighting cancer, Victoria was conceived after 34 exposures, including Operation Ivy and Bravo. Her mother's pregnancy was deemed presumptive for genetic damage, and she was treated as a high-risk pregnancy at San Diego Naval Base's Balboa Hospital. At age 12 in 1968, the Gold Team at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital revealed her future genetic risk. She was sat down at 12 years old and shown photos of Marshallese babies born with radiation-related genetic issues and told she was never allowed to have children at 12. Without her consent, she was placed on birth control by the United States Navy. Her family was required to exclusively use naval medical facilities due to her father's Q clearance, his many cancers, including the second penilectomy in the globe at the time, and a kaleidoscope of other cancers, for them to be researched and treatment needs. By 23, she required a full hysterectomy. She has survived the same cancers as her father by undergoing many surgeries and near-death experiences. Her Q clearance has now expired, and at age 62, she is able to channel her forced silence and emotions into her art. She and I founded StillGlowing after President Obama himself tried to intervene after he answered an email campaign that I had started. And even with his intervention, he was unable to help her. Many communities have yet to be seen or heard as affected by nuclear weapons at all. Some of them I call MacArthur's men. 40 to 70,000 men were sent into Japan shortly after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while on this humanitarian mission, many of them fell in love and started families, while still expected to stay silent. In just one case, a Japanese adult child found her father after many years of searching, 2 years after he had passed away in America. And she found out that he had been looking for her and that he tried to bring her and her mother to America, but he wasn't allowed. She had a family that loved her, and it was one of the most emotional phone calls I've had. These men remain unacknowledged as nuclear radiation-affected soldiers. Many have never recovered from what they have witnessed. Another veteran, Frank, received numerous military honors. He later developed cancer and passed away by 1961, leaving behind 2 daughters, aged 6 and 4. One was born with a severe hole in her heart, and rare immune deficiencies. The other daughter has lifelong autoimmune diseases. And Frank's adult children continue to battle the denial and secrecy surrounding their father's experience and death, causing them so much trauma on many levels. Many of the young men initially sent into the Pacific Proving Grounds and those sent in to clean up after the nuclear testing formed deep connections with the Marshall Islands and her people. Some carry guilt, knowing the mission wasn't a success in the cleanup. Many healthy young men, aged 18 to 25, their wives had miscarriages, multiple miscarriages, including late-stage miscarriages. My father included. My mother had 7 miscarriages, including one at 7.5 months. These men also, some came home sterile. Many suffered divorces, deep psychological distress. Now, as grown men, for those still living, many are reduced to tears believing their children and grandchildren suffer from cancers and birth defects that they believe are their fault. It is, of course, not true. The stress and concern they carry is palpable when I speak to them on the phone. Henry Mayo Jr. is another man that I've speak to. He was subjected to human chemical weapons testing at Fort McClellan, a Superfund base. He was denied care by the VA, and he has clear exposure. He takes a bus 200 miles to the nearest VA center, and even being interviewed by CNN and garnering much attention and hope, his situation didn't change. Despite everything, he remained a kind and dignified man, while his family carries the distress. Glenn Harrison Daniel, a decorated airborne ranger, witnessed the devastating effects of these weapons at Operation Red Wing. The airborne units were deployed to observe and assess the tests, often without adequate protection. The soldiers were exposed to varying radiation levels, leading to long-term consequences. Glenn suffered from cancer and deteriorating mental health. His son had trouble communicating to me how traumatizing it was in his family. He did confide in me that 2 of his siblings committed suicide with the stories that came home with his father from being in the Marshall Islands and witnessing the displaced people. And he wept when I said, "Would you like me to tell your father's story at this event?" And he cried. Nuclear weapons are still moving forward. I had a meeting with Tri-Valley Cares of Livermore in California, and I was told that Lawrence Livermore Laboratory are building new plutonium pits, something that hasn't been done for decades. The new science means more weapons-grade plutonium on the roads, exposing more drivers. It's in the lab for more experiments, generating more waste, and all within a 1 square mile facility, a quarter mile from families living their lives. I live 5 miles from the lab, and I've lived through numerous accidents at the lab. Survivors and descendants have built a worldwide network of support. We must acknowledge this history and address our future concerns. Many families are just now discovering their nuclear weapons connection after RECA has ended. The psychological, physical, and generational toll of these tests and use must be acknowledged and studied. We carry these stories not as relics of the past, but as urgent warnings and calls for justice. Those individuals exposed to nuclear weapons testing and use deserve transparency, medical care, and better outcomes and protocols. It is time for world leaders to break the silence, to declassify our medical histories, and ensure that no future generation suffers as we have. We're still here, we are still glowing, and we will not be silent.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Alan, please, the floor is yours. We're moving from the United States needs to watch.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Owen. I'm the founder of Lab Rats in the UK and the co-founder with Kathy of iGlow and Victoria. I am the son of this man. He's James Ronald Owen. He served in Her Majesty's Royal Navy at Operation Dominic, which was a joint UK-US operation on Christmas Island in 1962. Unfortunately, he died in 1994, aged just 52, from a heart attack. During his time on Christmas Island, he witnessed 24 detonations in 78 days. The largest of those being 7.7 megatons. The reason for these 24 detonations in 78 days is because it was time for the test ban treaty. So we needed to detonate as much as we could before the treaty came in. On the left of this slide is my brother. Unfortunately, he died in 1996, aged just 31. Again, from a massive heart attack. The image is that of my sister, who's also suffered a heart attack, but luckily survived. And I'm the youngest of 3 siblings. I was always told that I was the mistake. I had a brother and a sister, I was the mistake. I think there was a power cut that day, I think. And I thought I'd escaped the curse because there was nothing wrong with me. Unfortunately, in April 2022, I suffered a cardiac arrest. I was without a heartbeat for 8 minutes. But luckily for me, I had immediate CPR and 3 shocks from a defib to bring me back. This was administered by my friends and a team of well-trained people pitched in the top right at the leisure centre where I was at the time. The Wales Air Ambulance came to my aid, and the Welsh National Health Service operated on me and saved my life. This is me with Ruby, who was a critical care practitioner who was first on the scene and worked on me. This is the legacy of nuclear testing. It's real. You've heard it all today. Mine is just one story of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, of families worldwide who live with these effects every day, right now. The first British test was carried out in 1952 at the Montebello Islands in Australia. The UK, for those of you who don't know, tested 45 atmospheric weapons. They did 600 minor or subcritical trials in Maralinga in Australia, polluting the sacred lands of the Aboriginal people. And they also performed 24 underground tests in the Nevada desert. Yet the topic of the UK nuclear testing is not taught in the schools in the UK. The participants and their victims have been airbrushed from history. Their service was only recognised with a medal in 2022 after a 6-year battle by Lab Rats and the Daily Mirror with a journalist called Susie Boniface, who has championed our cause. We now have an academy which provides information on tests carried out across the world. This information was given to us courtesy of Bob Farquhar, who was an American atomic veteran. Unfortunately, he sadly passed away in 2024. This is why the Danieli study is so important. This is why the DNA study is so important. The UK government refuses to acknowledge any harm. They refuse to study the descendants, no matter how hard I've tried. They even refuse to send an observer to this meeting to listen to these stories, because this is where they should be, right there they should be. They even refuse to meet with us here in New York because they don't want to hear the truth. They are not listening to the voices of the veterans, the people who experience the deadliest of man's creations. The mushroom cloud is burnt into their souls. Their lives and their families' lives have been forever altered. They are not listening to the innocent indigenous people whose lands have been contaminated forever. These sacred lands have been used and abused. The innocent downwinders, the uranium miners, and everybody that's affected from nuclear disasters. We now have fourth-generation descendants, fifth-generation descendants who are experiencing the health issues that we've been listening to. Miscarriages, stillbirths, birth defects. Their bloodline has been forever altered by the testing program. So it's critical that these studies are completed, that they are used to influence the powers that be. Together with our testimonies, they become a powerful tool in the quest for disarmament. No one on the planet should ever experience what my father did, Kathy's father did, what your families did. These men who were sent to clean it up, the natural disasters. My mother died in 2011, age 69. She never got over losing her husband and her eldest son within 18 months of each other. She never saw some of her great-grandchildren. My youngest niece never saw my father. My sister was 8.5 months pregnant when he died. My sister buried my father and gave birth to her daughter within a couple of days of each other. My son, and he will hate me for that picture in the top right there, he will hate me for that. He's grown up never meeting my father. He never met his uncle. That's the legacy. So we stand as one nuclear community, showing the world that these weapons are deadly and that the effects last for generations. We must never forget these men, the women that supported these men, the women that suffered from the effects of the things that these men saw and the effect it had on their bodies. They are innocent victims, and those who gave the ultimate sacrifice, many of them unknowingly. My life might have been completely different. Who knows? If my father hadn't gone to the tests, he might still be here. But we've lost so many that have campaigned for decades. And throughout my life, as Kathy has done, and Keith and everybody else that's here today, we've campaigned for recognition, for an apology, for compensation, for the abolishment of these weapons. And I've met some amazing people, and I've met some amazing people already in the first couple of days that are here. The passion for this is incredible. They are doing amazing things, and you are all doing amazing work. The average age now of a UK nuclear test veteran is 85. And many believe that the UK government is waiting for them all to die before acknowledging the harm. And we estimate that we only have between 1,500 and 2,000 left, many of them here at our events that we hold in the UK. I encourage you all to support these studies, the Danieli inventory and the DNA study, because they are so important. 73 years is too long to wait. 73 years of denial and 73 years of betrayal. It's time now that the world woke up and started a new chapter in history. And that history has to be the one without nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
I'm awfully glad for the mistake, for the successful mistake. Thank you, Alan. Our next presenter goes further east. Sorry, thanks. My friend and colleague, Dr. Oksana Yakushko, was a child during the Chernobyl disaster. And she's also a member of our Ukraine working group.
Thank you all.
Please. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, it's on. Hello, everybody. So I will speak about the Chernobyl disaster, which I survived as a child. It occurred almost 40 years ago, April 26, 1986. It does remain the greatest anthropogenic or human-made nuclear technological catastrophe in history. And newly released documents, I encourage you to read them, show that at least 3 years before the accident, the Soviet government knew that the plant was extremely dangerous in operating, and yet they persisted. And so today I will speak about it because it isn't just a technological disaster that we survived. It's not a natural disaster, but how it was I experienced and how it continues to be used. As a reminder, a radioactivity released by the explosion of that station was 400 times the amount of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. It is, as an accident, still 10 times of the Fukushima nuclear disaster that was recent as a result of a tsunami. And it was, Fukushima is rated 7 out of 7 on international nuclear radiological events, and still Chernobyl is 10 times the amount. Just no scale seems large enough to fit. If you know some about Chernobyl, it is an ongoing radioactive wound because its sarcophagus, which covers the reactor, is incapable of releasing tremendous amounts of radiation, is going to do so for the next 200,000 years or so. It is surrounded by what is known as exclusion or dead zone of about 30 kilometers wide. And to those of you who watch the news about the war in my country of Ukraine, it is used as a nuclear terrorist threat. During the early days of the invasion, Russian troops rolled through the entire area, radioactive and all. They looted the safety facilities. They held safety workers at gunpoint for weeks without medicine and any kind of treatment, and they left the area filled with explosive mines. It still is filled with explosive devices. Just last month, just on February 14th, on Valentine's Day, 2025, a guided Russian missile hit the sarcophagus and leaving a large hole in its protective shell. Such Chernobyl can be a nuclear threat. And to name the country that has more nuclear weapons combined, and what did it do with its own legacy of that, and how the nuclear terrorism is still used by them towards my family in Ukraine. I want to highlight 3 human-focused impacts of Chernobyl and its intergenerational impact. Certainly, the disaster itself is enormous. Believed about 8 million people were exposed to radiation, hundreds of thousands. I think it's somewhere like 600 to 800,000 people were sent to volunteer. They're, forcibly sent without protection, often to, quote, liquidate the disaster. My mother was among them. She's a civil engineer. Most of her colleagues that were sent to test soil and so forth are dead. In fact, most of my family, including my generation cousins, have also died of numerous diseases. She's has Chernobyl disability and has numerous conditions. But the most psychologically damaging when I look back as a child was all the lying and propaganda and purposeful harm to those of us and what I call the acts of dehumanization. Sure, it was failed technology, but it also was a failure of a political system that was, in my recollection, built on lies, propaganda, threats, and secrecy. If you know or recall, Gorbachev government continually lied about what happened, even when the entire northern hemisphere had highly radioactive nuclear particles within days of explosion. We were told nothing had happened. In Sweden and Germany, I look at pictures, people were burning food and protecting themselves, giving people iodine. The government from Moscow ordered me, my sister, Ukrainians, to march outside on May Day parades and for days to be in outdoor activities celebrating the May Day events. In those released newly documents, the government in Moscow held in their hands the documents that showed that the radiation levels in Kiev, where I was, were at about 1,000 millimeters an hour. They were telling us on TV that was 2. So 50,000% higher than they were telling us. Once, they couldn't hold the lid on it. It was such a terror and panic. I recall such disorientation. And the government message continually was, nothing's much happening. And if you talk about it, or that is part of Western propaganda, so you have to stay silent and so forth. So many things can be said. I can speak for myself that 2 years later, for 2 years, I had all kinds of strange conditions. Now they should be obvious to anybody because they were connected to thyroid malfunction, and I have a Hashimoto disease and radiation exposure. But it took 2 more years, so 4 years, for me to finally find someone who could diagnose an obvious radioactive disorder. Because, again, the propaganda, if you watch it, it's powerful. We were all told that nothing was wrong with us, that it was this new psychological disorder called radiophobia. It was all in our heads. So in terms of generational impact, lies, and I'm hearing them here, propaganda, harm. They harm. I feel like even now when I hear, what's going on, and I know for people, there's this anxiety, disorientation, anger, resentment, and I think there's more to be studied there. The other thing I will highlight, I don't recall any help. My parents were told to give us red wine, and it's like completely bogus information. But not only were we made to march in radioactive dust clouds, we were fed radioactive food. We were made to work with radioactive materials with no protection and so forth, so on. The only people were in Moscow. They were all radiation free for their food and so forth. So again, we were sent as children, my sister and I, we recall, for 100 days without our parents, no information, no help, no medical help. It was horrifying. We thought, we were told we would die. Our parents have died. Everybody will die, and just was really, really terrifying. Those of us as psychologists, I study learned helplessness. Those of you know that concept. It's based on torturing animals, torturing when someone is harmed. People or animals, but not given help. That's when learned helplessness developed. And I will say the impact generationally, because I'm a psychologist working with Ukrainians under condition of war. What happens if you have someone with that learned helplessness? They fall apart in any conditions of stress. So I work with people who bombs are falling, there's just threat to life, and they cannot help themselves. They feel so disoriented. And so how learned helplessness and the burden of it for next generation impacts. And last thing I will say, I think, we're talking about it's important to study things, but, my sense has been people come and go, and they kind of look at, people, even out of Ukraine, it's like, is it this, is it that? Like, how does radiation impact? But there's just such and arguments and minimizations, a dehumanizing impact, that we're human beings, that we're experienced this horrific catastrophe and how to remain human and look at human impact of such. And that's maybe what I hear here, so forth. So like even today, between Chernobyl, Zaporizhia nuclear, what I hear in the news, it's like, well, it could be threat to other countries. But, what about a terror threat of again, living with this nuclear bomb in the back of our yards, of my family yards now? Because we're not a lesson, we're not an accident, we're not a conflict or crisis management. They're human beings, and how to approach human beings who really need to be seen in such events. Because when we dehumanize, and that's what maybe you hear, and you can study, and as a psychologist, people don't value their lives. So in my parents' generation, my own, with my cousins and others, the substance abuse is enormous. Suicides are incredibly high because people do not value themselves, and it impacts new generations. I have to fight all of this in myself. So to finish with that, I think that it has to be about truth. It has to be about justice for survivors. We have to, maybe learn to punish propaganda. When people start spouting lies about this, we have to stand firm and say no, because that has impact. Governments should be held accountable. And I think that human beings in all of this, that human beings must come first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oksana. I will now take you to the world of science a bit about this, because that's what we're trying to establish. So I have the privilege of creating the Danieli Inventory of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, which is tailored specifically to second and third and future generations. Okay, it's very important because you have a whole lot of other instruments, but they're tailored for the normal way of life in general. They're not tailored specifically and based on the experience of second and third generation. It is, as Kathy mentioned, it is the global gold standard for studying, treating, and preventing intergenerational effects of massive trauma. It has been translated, adapted, and used worldwide with numerous massively traumatized populations. Here, together with Kathy, Keith, and Alan, and Kathleen, we adapted the original Danieli inventory, which was validated with 500 adult children of Holocaust survivors for radiation and bomb-affected survivors' offspring, with all the relevant languages as well. So to my Japanese colleagues, it is translated into Japanese, it is translated into Marshallese, to French. It's available, and it's just waiting desperately to be used before we all go away. So this inventory is an essential part of documenting intergenerational legacies of trauma. Below, I will describe its development and utilization with only few necessary technical terms. Multi-generational legacies of trauma, not yet. Multi-generational legacies of suffering and trauma are as old as humankind and are integral to our understanding of human history. Transmitted in word, deed, even in silence, as you heard. They have been chronicled, contemplated, and examined both orally and in writing in all societies, cultures, and religions, and analyzed in multiple dimensions by scholars from many disciplines. Transmission mechanisms range from the biological, as you heard, to the psychological, to the familial, to the socio-ethnocultural, to the political. Transmission modes are not mutually exclusive. Rather, for most individuals, they reflect some overlap and a cumulative effect. Our time does not allow review of the multiple relevant studies, but they can be found in the ICMGLT library, or I'm here in New York, just write to me, talk to me, and you'll get everything you need. So let me go to the theory behind the inventory. My own trauma and the continuity of self, a multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary, integrative theoretical framework, comprehensively describes the complex nature of surviving massive trauma and the diverse ways of adapting to life's challenges in its aftermath. The framework's overarching features are its focus on self or identity. It will come soon. Alan knows the words. Self-identity. So remember that. Self-identity. It's not just a little piece of one. It's all of ourselves. Okay? Self-identity, multidimensionality, it's never unidimensional. Don't ever listen to you can listen, but don't believe anybody who tells you that there is a unidimensional answer to this. There isn't. The ubiquitous, what you heard very dramatically here, the ubiquitous conspiracy of silence in the aftermath of trauma. It is an integral part of the theory. It's what we call the trauma after the trauma. I'll talk more about it. Continuity versus rupture, and identity healing and repair. So the repair is not just for the cancer, if possible. The repair is for one's identity, for one's self, for one's people, for one's family, for one's children. Okay, now we can go. So just that's quite simple. An individual identity involves a complex interplay of multiple spheres of systems, including but not limited to, as you heard, biological, intrapsychic, that means internal, right? Familial, and communal, economic, cultural, national, environmental, international, onward. Let's go to the next one. These systems dynamically coexist along the time dimension, you see, from past to present to future. Exposure to trauma, if you sort of imagine an elevator, free flow, exposure to trauma creates a rupture, okay? A rupture in this free flow and being stuck. The degree of the rupture, fragmentation and disorientation, is determined by the time, duration, extent, and meaning of the trauma to the individual, but it is also determined by the survival mechanisms and strategies used to adapt to it. The degree of the rupture is further exacerbated, and this is built into the trauma theory, further exacerbated by what we call the trauma after the trauma, by how others respond. For example, societal indifference to, avoidance and denial, or the survivor's experience and the survivor's reaction to that. I received my doctorate actually on studying the conspiracy of silence. I found 49 ways of not listening. So maybe we should have had this presentation, but next time I'll present that piece. So we are very complicated, we're very made to not listen. Elsewhere, I have named and studied this ubiquitous post-trauma conspiracy of silence in depth, as I mentioned. Dutch psychologist Carl Kyleson named these phenomena the third traumatic phase sequence. So before the trauma, and then what happens after. Very important. New York psychiatrist Martin Simmons named it the second wound in the context of crime. Like, for example, the first question a rape survivor is asked is, what were you wearing? But let's come back to just this and be disciplined. Others use the term homecoming stress to explain the detrimental consequences for veterans and their offspring. The result may render the victim survivor vulnerable, particularly to further trauma, ruptures through the life cycle, such as illness and disability, or in this room, the use of sacred lands for radiation experiments or dumping radioactive waste, mining, downwinders, or nuclear disasters, as you read. Next slide. It can also turn immediate response to trauma chronic. In many survival tactics evolve into lifelong ways of being and approaches to life, forming lasting adjustment patterns that I named post-trauma adaptational styles. It's very important to understand. I call it adaptational because it's the best we can do in those circumstances. I don't view them as pathological. I view them as the best we can do to survive a situation, okay? So it's a whole different point of view, so please remember that. These patterns include the psychological and behavioral coping, mastery, and defense mechanism that the victim survivor utilize as strategies for survival during and after the traumatic experience. It's the after that makes the problem, right? Because it's no longer needed, but you continue as if you're still inside the trauma. They become an integral part of the survivor's personality, repertoire of defense or character armor, view of him or herself, of others, and of the world. The survivor's way of being in the world. These adaptational styles also shape the survivor's parenting and family life, and in turn, their children's upbringing, emotional development, identity, and beliefs about themselves, their peers, their societies, in the world, thereby becoming intergenerational. You see? Yes, I hope. The parent's adaptational styles thus become the child's biopsychosocial milieu that ultimately influences the severity of what we call the child's reparative adaptational impacts. Adaptational, you understand. The child adapts to whatever he or she are presented with. Reparative, you'll hear about a very important word here. Scientifically exploring if data could support this theory of multi-generational impacts to us, the important question was not if children of survivors have mental health problems. Surely some do, some don't. But rather, who among them have mental health problems? To gather the data, it was first necessary to create measures of these various constructs that were tailored specifically to survivors' offspring. Right. Part 1 measured post-traumatic adaptational styles of the parents as perceived by their children for each parent, both mother and father. As shown on this slide, exploratory factors analysis yielded 3 higher-order factors reflecting intensities of victim style, numb style, and fighter style, with clear distinctions among these 3 styles. Victim style was characterized as being stuck in the trauma rupture, emotional volatility, and overprotectiveness. Numb style by emotional detachment, conspiracy of silence in the family, don't talk, we heard that, and intolerance of weakness. You always have to be, you know, I see, you know what I'm talking about, right, okay. And fighter style by valuing and maintaining one's identity and valuing mastery and justice. You heard these voices around the room. Where am I? These scales were highly reliable, as shown by measures of internal consistency and cross-language congruence. In addition to structuring the survey in an understandable format, it was extremely important that participants can complete it in their own culturally contextualized native language. For example, as I mentioned, Marshallese and Gilbert Trees, we are still waiting for your ambassador friend from Kiribati to do that. Okay, let me go to part 2, so you can go to the next slide. Reparative adaptational impacts. I already explained the word adaptational. Okay. This measured survivors' children perceptions of themselves and their upbringing. This construct expresses the core, perhaps unconscious, motivation of the second generation to undo and repair the past and heal their parents and themselves. Basically, it's love. It consists of 36-item scale. As seen in this slide, the reparative adaptational impact, and it's plural impacts because they're impacts from parents to children, from children to their own children, and they're multiple, of course. They reflect the offspring's self-reported insecurity about their own incompetence, their own competence. I always hope it would be the other way around. Reparative protectiveness, need for control, obsession with the trauma, defensive psychosocial constriction, and immature dependency. Within the radiation-exposed community, the child might have an obsession with the father's participation in the nuclear testing program, for example. In a subsample of participants who were also interviewed using the structural clinical interview for DSM disorders, this is a bit too technical, but just to share the finding, the RAI, as we call it, reparative adaptational impacts, were highly related to the high likelihood of meeting criteria for psychological disorder. When reparative adaptational impacts were high, almost half of the participants met criteria for one or more disorders. Of the skin-defined disorders studied, generalized anxiety disorder was the most frequent, followed by major depressive disorder and PTSD. Now, for those of you who keep hearing about PTSD goes from parents to children, notice please, the one that's most frequent is not PTSD, it's general anxiety disorder. The second more frequent is depression, and PTSD is the littlest percentage. So please, again, no unidimensional anything, okay? Remember, it just doesn't work so simply. Diagnosis. Okay. Parent style, I think we need the next one. Parent style were also correlated with the presence of disorder. The severity of offspring RAI was strongly related to the parent's victim adaptational style. Okay, see how it works? The mother's effect on the children was stronger, but most mother and father styles contributed. The most detrimental situation for the child was when both mother and father had intense victim style. This effect is central to our hypothesized model shown in this slide. You can see that, right? Okay. Next. Part 3 of the inventory gathers information on 4-generation family history and dynamics. These inquiries were crucial to enabling us to evaluate the model where family background and environmental forecast post-trauma adaptational styles, which subsequently influences children's reparative adaptational impact. Initial evaluation of Part 3 assisted us in pinpointing the key elements for additional analysis. In our study, the two most influential components of family history were the mother's age cohort, how old the mother was, if she were a child, adolescent or adult, and the nature of parents' traumatic experiences. We have adjusted this to in the radiation exposure study to parents' experiences of, quotes, the bomb or testing programs. We hypothesized that the effect of family history and family milieu in the offspring would be indirect. That means the effect goes through the parents to the child. The data largely supported this model. One of the most influential indirect effects was sociocultural settings. I think it's better if those of you are interested, write to me and I will send you the actual publication of this. So you have the time to really get into it, understand, because it does get very complicated, but very importantly, right? So each one of these issues are, what is important for me, what is important to me to say is, as I mentioned before, what happens after the trauma affects the lifelong lives of the survivors and the future generations. It's not just the trauma. And this is now scientifically established. So that would save a lot of crying, I think, if we actually publish it as scientific But we need data. The problem with the radiation version is only very few people responded. And without data, I cannot say that about the radiation victims or the children, because we don't have the data. So if you want to help us have a scientific voice, please complete the study. It exists, complete, as many as possible.
We have a question here.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Midori. I am a third generation Hibakusha. My grandmother her name was Ruko. She was in Nagasaki, and she was about 9 years old. And I had two questions, if that's okay. I wanted to ask how to get involved with the study, if I qualify. I'm not sure. Okay, cool. I thought so. And then.
At the beginning of the questionnaire, you'll see actually the questionnaire asks you for your relationship to the event.
Okay.
And then you're not going to
Just say, if you come and grab us afterwards, we're going to get you to.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Yeah, if you come and grab us afterwards, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Definitely qualify.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
everybody qualifies because they're different ways to study different people.
Okay.
And so, yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just summarize.
Thank you.
So what we want to do is just finish. You can ask us questions outside. I know we're running late a time.
We have just, the ambassador wants to say a few more.
Yes.
Keith and I had the real honor of spending a lot of time with the ambassador who told us his own story, and I think maybe take a minute to not to deprive these people.
Thank you. And I don't want to keep you here any further than necessary. Just briefly, if you look to your across, you will see the young people over there. They're from the Marshall Islands. They were here, and we had a program on Saturday. They presented skits and story similar to what we're doing here, story of the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. And Saturday was the 1st of March to commemorate the Bravo shot in the Marshall Islands that really affected a lot of people, including the displacement and forced migration of people from their islands. Some of our people have never been able to go back because the islands are contaminated. And some islands actually have been wiped off from the map. They just disappeared because of the testing. So they're not there anymore. But these young kids and their sponsors were able to make it to New York. They always do this in Arkansas, where the major population of the Marshall is relocated. But this time around, they decided they were going to bring it to New York. And so we were very happy that a number of you were there in the ceremonies that were held on Saturday. But beyond that, let me just briefly thank Dr. Daniel and Mr. Kiefer and all of this group that has brought us here today. Just last Saturday when we were celebrating, not celebrating, but commemorating the explosion, I think it's 71 years ago. At that same time, my sister, who lives in Hawaii, she can't go back to the Marshalls because she has been undergoing a number of cancer treatments, including leukemia and surgery and all of that. But she was celebrating her 45th birthday. I wasn't there, but I saw a picture of it, and her husband passed away because of the COVID, but they have only one daughter. So the daughter decided to make a big celebration because she just got out of the hospital again after another treatment of cancer treatment, leukemia. And so they had a big celebration, but they were able to show me pictures of it. But the thing I want to point out is that like we talk about intergenerational, and my other two uncles have died of cancer, and my sister will never go back to the Marshall Islands. I guess the only time we'll see her go back to the Marshall if she passed away, because there is no treatment in the Marshall Islands. There is no way she can get the proper treatment for her cancer and related sickness. So she has to stay in Hawaii. But that's the story of just one. But a lot of people in the Marshall have developed different kinds of cancers. And I think if we compare our population to the rest of the Pacific, we have more cancer-related sicknesses than the rest of the Pacific countries. And it's because of the testing that took place in the islands. I know, 2 years ago I was in Kiribati at Christmas Island. And I was there with some sort of meetings there. And I had wanted to go to the test sites on Christmas Island to look at those sites in comparison to the Marshall Islands, because I have been to the two islands in the Marshall Islands that were directly affected by the nuclear testing. And I was in Enewetak when they were doing cleanup work. So I may have run into you, I'm not sure, but I was there when they do the cleanup, part of the cleanup project. So I had wanted to go to the test site in Christmas Island, but unfortunately I couldn't find the time to do it. But I have been working with the ambassador from Kiribati, who's here, and we have been working with, and I'm collaborating with Kachika-san, looking at the possibility of forming a group within the UN members of ambassadors to see how we could progress this work and also collaborate with Daniel and rest of the group. I think the more we can collaborate, I think the more we can push this thing forward, because it affects all of us in many ways. And hearing these stories, it really reminds me of the importance of what we're doing here and what we should do to move forward on it, because after all, we're doing it for the next generation. Mm-hmm. It's really not us, because we're past that, but it's to the next generation and generation after that. Okay. So that's all I could say.
Thank you so much. After